The helicopter's rotors carved through monsoon rain like blades through silk, each revolution throwing arcs of water into the Vietnamese night. Inside the Huey's cramped belly, 7 men sat in various states of exhaustion, their faces painted with mud and something darker. They didn't look at the woman strapped near the open door. They never did. Captain Marlowe, Viper, Kine had stopped expecting eye contact 3 months into her tour. What she hadn't stopped expecting was the sudden shove that sent her tumbling into black space at 4,000 feet. The push came from behind, professional, calculated, the kind of motion that could be explained away as turbulence, as accident, as the chaos of combat extraction. Marlowe's fingers grazed the door frame for a microsecond before gravity claimed her, and in that fragment of time she saw Sergeant Davies' face. Not shocked, not horrified, satisfied. The wind swallowed her scream and the jungle canopy rushed up like a closing fist. But Marlowe Kine hadn't survived 2 tours by accepting death's invitations. Her hand found the emergency tether she'd been mocked for installing on her own flight vest, the one the other pilots called Viper's paranoia cord. The one that wasn't regulation. The one that snapped taut 30 feet below the Huey's skids with a force that nearly dislocated her shoulder. She hung there, spinning in the rotor wash, rain hammering her face as the helicopter lurched sideways. Through the open door, she could see Davies leaning out, his expression shifting from satisfaction to confusion to something approaching fear. Then the Huey's engine coughed. Once, twice. The turbine whine that had been steady background music suddenly fractured into a grinding shriek. Marlowe watched the pilot, Chief Warrant Officer Brennan, wrestling the controls, his movements becoming jerky, desperate. The helicopter began to spin, slowly at first, then faster, the tail rotor losing authority. They were going down, all of them, and she was the only one who knew why. The tether bit into her ribs as she pulled herself upward, hand over hand, the rotors screaming above her like dying angels. Her arms burned. Her shoulder socket felt like shattered glass. But Marlowe Kine had learned to fly in her grandfather's crop duster over Kansas wheat fields before she could legally drive, and she understood something these men never would. The sky doesn't care about your gender, your rank, or your worthiness. The sky only cares if you respect it enough to survive it. The helicopter dropped 50 feet in a sickening lurch, and Marlowe's boots finally found purchase on the skid. She could see Brennan's face now, pale and straining, sweat mixing with rain. His eyes met hers through the plexiglass, and in them she saw the question every combat pilot dreads: how much time do we have? She held up 3 fingers. 3 minutes. Maybe less. The hydraulic line she'd noticed leaking before takeoff had finally given out, and Davies' shove had distracted everyone from her warning. Now the fluid was gone, the controls were dying, and 7 men were about to become statistics because they'd chosen pride over protocol. Marlowe swung herself toward the door with a movement born from gymnastics training her father had insisted on, from the hours spent on uneven bars while boys threw rocks and jeered. Davies grabbed her vest, whether to help or hinder she couldn't tell. Didn't matter. She was already past him, crawling across men too shocked to move, reaching the cockpit where Brennan fought against controls that had become suggestions rather than commands. She didn't ask permission. She gripped the collective with her left hand and felt the Huey's dying heart beating through the metal. Her right hand found the cyclic, and her feet found the pedals Brennan couldn't manage alone. Together, without words, they became a single pilot with 4 hands and one desperate prayer. The triple canopy jungle rose up through the darkness like a solid wall. Marlowe's grandfather's voice echoed in her head, the same words he'd spoken the first time she'd stalled his Piper Cub at 800 feet. Fear is just your body asking if you remember your training. Her training said they needed a clearing. The map she'd memorized said there was a riverbed 2 clicks east. The instrument panel said they had 90 seconds before the transmission ceased completely. She keyed the intercom with her chin, her voice cutting through the chaos with an eerie calm that made the men in back finally fall silent. All wait starboard. Now, move or die. They moved. Even Davies moved. The Huey tilted, caught a thermal rising from the sun-baked river valley, and gained 60 precious feet. Brennan's hands trembled on the controls. His breathing came in short gasps that Marlowe recognized as the beginning of panic, the thing that killed pilots more efficiently than enemy fire. She pressed her shoulder against his, a point of contact that said, "I'm here," without words. His breathing steadied. They flew as one organism now, anticipating each other's adjustments, feeling the dying helicopter's responses like parents interpreting a sick child's cries. The river appeared below them, a silver thread in the darkness. Marlowe spotted the sandbar she'd gambled on, 30 meters of blessed emptiness in an ocean of trees. "Flare on my mark," she said. Brennan nodded, his jaw set. Behind them, the men had gone absolutely quiet, the kind of silence that comes when death is close enough to feel its breath. 3 seconds from impact, Marlowe pulled the collective as hard as her damaged shoulder could manage, bleeding off forward speed in a maneuver that would have made her instructors weep. The Huey's nose pitched up violently. Men slammed against the bulkhead. Equipment tore loose. And then, with a grinding crunch that sounded like the end of the world, the skids hit sand. The helicopter bounced once, spun 45 degrees, and settled into the riverbed with a final mechanical sigh. The rotors wound down in the sudden silence, and for a moment no one moved. No one breathed. Then Brennan turned to her, his face younger than his 32 years, and said, "How the fuck did you?" She was already moving, already unstrapping, already checking the men who'd watched her fall. Davies sat against the bulkhead, his face ash-gray. His eyes followed her movements with something she'd never seen in them before. Not respect, not yet, but the beginning of a question he didn't know how to ask. Marlowe checked each man methodically, her medic training taking over, looking for fractures, for internal bleeding, for the invisible injuries that killed later. They were bruised, scared, alive, all of them. When she reached Davies, he flinched. "Why?" he asked, and the word held more weight than its single syllable suggested. She met his eyes then, really met them, and saw not the man who'd pushed her but the boy who'd learned that women were either mothers or mysteries, never warriors. "Because," she said quietly, "I took an oath to bring everyone home, even people who don't want me to." The radio crackled to life before Davies could respond. "Angel 7, this is Condor Base. We lost your beacon. Status." Brennan reached for the handset, but his hand was shaking too badly. Marlowe took it, her voice steady as stone. "Condor Base, Angel 7. Emergency landing in grid Victor Tango 779 or 4. 7 souls, all ambulatory, mechanical failure. Request extraction at first light." There was a pause, then, "Roger that, Angel 7. Extraction team wheels up at 0500. How'd you put her down in that terrain?" Marlowe looked at the men watching her, at Brennan's wondering expression, at Davies' shame. "Carefully," she said. "Very carefully." She handed the mic back and moved to the door, staring out at the jungle that had nearly claimed them all. The rain had stopped. Stars appeared between shredding clouds, impossibly bright against the black. Marlowe's shoulder throbbed with each heartbeat, a symphony of torn ligaments and bruised bone. She'd need surgery, probably months of physical therapy, possibly the end of her flying career. And yet, standing in the doorway of a broken helicopter surrounded by men who'd wished her gone, she felt something close to peace. Her grandfather had taught her many things, but the most important was this: competence is its own vindication. You don't prove yourself by demanding recognition. You prove yourself by being the one still standing when the proving is done. She pulled out a cigarette she didn't smoke, lit it with hands that barely trembled, and let the smoke drift into the humid air. Behind her she heard the men moving, whispering. Brennan joined her in the doorway, his eyes red-rimmed. "You knew about the hydraulics," he said. Not a question. She nodded. "Told the ground crew, told you, was overruled." She didn't say by whom, didn't need to. Brennan was quiet for a long moment then. "The tether, the one we gave you shit for." She took a drag of the cigarette, tasted nothing, handed it to him. "My grandfather crashed 4 times, walked away from all of them. Said the difference between a pilot and a corpse is preparation someone else thinks is paranoid." Brennan laughed, a sound somewhere between humor and hysteria. "Jesus Christ, Kine, you climbed back onto a falling helicopter." She smiled then, small and sad. "Wasn't falling yet, just confused." It was a lie, and they both knew it. The night sounds returned gradually. Insects, distant howlers, the river's whisper over stones. Marlowe's body began to register the damage. Her shoulder was swelling, the joint already stiffening. Two ribs on her left side felt wrong, shifted, possibly cracked. Her hands were raw from the tether, the skin on her palms shredded. But she'd felt worse. Boot camp had been worse. Her first crash landing in a civilian glider had been worse. Her father's funeral, watching them fold the flag while her brothers accepted condolences and she stood invisible in her dress uniform, had been worse. Pain was temporary. Legacy was forever. And tonight, whether these men acknowledged it or not, she'd written a page in a story that didn't end with her falling. Davies appeared beside her, moving like a man approaching a loaded weapon. "I need to," he started. "Don't," she said quietly. "Not now, not here." He swallowed hard, and she saw his throat work against whatever words he'd prepared. "You're going to report me." She turned to face him fully, this sergeant who tried to kill her, whose reasons she understood even if she'd never forgive them. His sister had died in a field hospital in Da Nang, sepsis from a shrapnel wound, while the female nurses were blamed for inadequate care. He told that story drunk one night, not knowing Marlowe was in earshot. He'd built his hatred on grief's foundation, and grief made men do unforgivable things. "If I report you," she said, "I have to explain why you did it. I have to explain that you blame women for your sister's death. I have to put that in writing. And then your daughters back home have to live with knowing their father tried to murder someone who looked like them." The blood drained from Davies' face. "How do you? I know everything about everyone I fly with, Sergeant. Your girls are 9 and 12. Emma wants to be a veterinarian. Cassidy plays softball and writes poetry. You have their pictures in your helmet bag under the spare socks." He stared at her like she was a ghost, a witch, something beyond his understanding of the world's order. "So here's what happens," Marlowe continued. "You live with what you did. You think about it every single day. You watch your daughters grow up and wonder if they'll ever meet someone who hates them for what they are instead of who they are. And maybe, if you're capable of it, you become the man they deserve to have as a father. That's your punishment. Living." She turned away before he could respond. The night stretched long and thick. The men took turns on watch, though there was little point. If the NVA found them before extraction, a lookout wouldn't save them. But the ritual mattered. The pretense of control mattered. Marlowe sat apart from the group, cradling her injured shoulder, watching the stars wheel overhead. She thought about her grandfather, gone 5 years now, his crop duster sold to pay hospital bills. She thought about her mother, who'd begged her not to enlist, who'd said the military would break her the way it had broken her father. She thought about every person who told her flying was for boys, that helicopters were too powerful for women's reflexes, that combat was no place for someone built soft. And she felt the Huey skids hitting sand again and again in her mind, that perfect, terrible moment when skill erased every doubt. Brennan sat beside her without asking. They didn't speak for 20 minutes, just two pilots listening to the jungle breathe. Finally, he said, "I'm putting you in for a Distinguished Flying Cross." She shook her head. "Don't. You saved 7 lives. I did my job. Your job doesn't include getting pushed out of a helicopter and climbing back on." She looked at him then, really looked, and saw something she hadn't expected, not just gratitude but recognition. The kind of recognition that changes how a person sees the world. "If you put me in for a DFC," she said carefully, "you have to explain what happened, why I was outside the aircraft, why the emergency became an emergency." Brennan's jaw tightened. "You're protecting him." "I'm protecting everyone, including you. You were aircraft commander. You missed a hydraulic leak on pre-flight." The accusation hung between them like cordite smoke. Brennan's face went through several expressions before settling on resignation. "You told me about the leak," he admitted. "I thought you were being paranoid. Female pilots always seem." He stopped himself. Marlowe waited. "Go ahead," she said. "Say it. Female pilots always seem what?" He had the decency to look ashamed. "Overly cautious, like they're trying too hard to prove they belong." She laughed, a sound with no humor in it. "We are trying to prove we belong. Every single flight, every single day. Because the first time we make a normal mistake, it becomes proof that women can't fly. When you miss a hydraulic leak, you're having a bad day. When I report a hydraulic leak that you miss, I'm being paranoid. The truth of it settled over them like fog. Brennan opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. "I'm sorry," he finally said, and the words carried the weight of revelation. Dawn came slowly, bleeding pink and gold across the river valley. Marlowe watched the light transform the jungle from threat to cathedral, each tree becoming distinct, each leaf catching fire in the early sun. Her shoulder had stiffened completely during the night. Her ribs throbbed with each breath. But she was alive, and the men were alive, and somewhere in the provincial capital, crews were spinning up helicopters to bring them home. She heard the distant thump of rotors before anyone else, her ears trained to distinguish friendly from hostile signatures. "Cavalry's here," she said, and the men stirred from their various positions. They looked at her differently now, their eyes holding questions they'd never thought to ask before. Who was she? Where had she learned to fly like that? Why had she saved them after what they'd done, what they'd allowed? The extraction birds came in fast and low, two Hueys trailing a Cobra gunship as escort. They settled into the riverbed in sequence, their rotor wash throwing sand in stinging clouds. The lead crew chief jumped out before the skids fully touched, his eyes scanning for casualties. When he saw all 7 men standing, his eyebrows rose. "Angel 7, he shouted over the turbine whine. Brennan pointed to Marlowe. The crew chief's expression cycled through surprise, skepticism, and finally acceptance as he took in the dead helicopter behind them. Its position impossible to believe, its survival a testament to skill that transcended gender. "Ma'am," he said, "how the hell did you—" "Lucky," Marlowe interrupted. "We got lucky." She herded the men toward the extraction birds with efficient movements, checking each one again, making sure they were stable for flight. Davies went last, and as he passed her, he stopped. "Captain Kine," he said formally. She met his eyes. "I know," she said. "Don't waste it on words, waste it on change." The flight back to base was quiet, each man lost in his own thoughts, processing the night's events through the lens of their own prejudices and assumptions. Marlowe sat by the door again, watching the jungle pass beneath them, green and infinite and indifferent to human drama. She thought about the moment Davies had pushed her, the way her body had hung between sky and earth, tethered by a cord everyone had mocked. She thought about her grandfather's voice. "Always have a backup plan, Marlowe. Pride kills pilots. Preparation saves them." And she thought about the expression on Brennan's face when she'd taken the controls, the moment of decision when he'd had to choose between his pride and his life. He'd chosen life. They all had. And that choice had cost them something precious, the comfortable certainty of their superiority. The base appeared on the horizon, a sprawl of tents and sandbags and desperate order imposed on chaos. As they approached, Marlowe could see crews gathered near the flight line, more people than usually watched a routine extraction. Word had spread. It always did. The helicopter touched down gently, and before the skids had settled, before the rotors had begun their wind-down cycle, men were running toward them. Not to check on Brennan or the crew, to check on her. The female pilot who'd gone down in Indian country and somehow walked everyone out alive. She climbed down carefully, favoring her injured shoulder, and found herself surrounded by faces that had never looked at her directly before. Fellow pilots, crew chiefs, even Major Rothstein, the squadron commander who'd openly opposed her assignment. They parted as she walked, a biblical division of doubters made silent by proof. The squadron surgeon, Captain Elena Vasquez, was waiting with a medical team. She took one look at Marlowe's shoulder and swore in Spanish. "How bad?" Marlowe asked. "Bad enough that you're not flying for at least 3 months, maybe 6. The words should have devastated her. Flying was everything. Flying was the only place she'd ever been judged solely by her competence. Flying was the language she spoke better than English. But as Vasquez guided her toward the medical tent, Marlowe felt something unexpected, relief. She'd proven whatever there was to prove. The sky had tested her and she'd passed. Let them ground her now. Let them send her stateside for surgery and rehabilitation. The thing was done. The question was answered. She'd shown them what female pilots could do when the universe demanded everything. And though she'd never say it aloud, though humility was armor she wore like a second skin. Marlo Kine knew with absolute certainty that she'd flown better in those 3 minutes than most men flew in a lifetime. The examination was thorough and painful. Separated shoulder, 2 cracked ribs, severe soft tissue damage to both hands, minor concussion, dehydration, exhaustion so deep it showed in her blood work. Vasquez worked with practiced efficiency, her hands gentle despite their clinical purpose. "You should be dead," she said quietly. "Multiple times over, the fall alone." "I didn't fall," Marlo corrected. "I jumped." It was a lie, but it was the lie they'd all agreed to maintain. The official story: Captain Kine had deployed her emergency tether to inspect exterior damage noticed during flight. The hydraulic failure occurred during her inspection. She climbed back aboard to assist with the emergency landing. Clean, simple, impossible to prove otherwise. Davies would keep his career. Brennan would keep his conscience. And Marlo would keep her secret, that she'd been murdered and had refused to die. The morphine made the world soft at its edges, turned the harsh Vietnamese sun into something almost gentle. Marlo floated in a pharmaceutical haze while Vasquez set her shoulder with a pop that echoed through her skeleton. She heard herself make a sound, something between a gasp and a sob, but the pain was distant, theoretical. Vasquez wrapped her in bandages that felt like absolution, each layer a binding of the night's wounds into something that could heal. "You're a goddamn hero," Vasquez whispered. Marlo shook her head, slow motion in the morphine sea. Just a pilot who remembered her training. But Vasquez gripped her good hand with an intensity that cut through the drugs. "No, listen to me. Women like us, we don't get to be good enough. We have to be perfect. And last night you were perfect. Don't diminish it." The words settled into Marlo's chest like stones, like ballast, like weight that could keep a person grounded when everything else wanted to throw them into empty air. She woke in the recovery ward to find Major Rothstein sitting beside her cot. He looked older than she remembered, the lines around his eyes deeper, his shoulders carrying a burden they hadn't held before. He didn't speak immediately. Neither did she. They sat in the peculiar silence of people who have been wrong and know it and don't know how to begin the apology. Finally, Rothstein cleared his throat. "I opposed your assignment," he said. "I made my opposition official. On record." Marlo said nothing. "I thought women in combat aviation was political theater. I thought the brass was sacrificing readiness for headlines. I thought—" He stopped, his voice catching on something that might have been shame. "I thought you'd get someone killed." He looked at her then, this man who'd made her life quietly miserable for 6 months, and his eyes held the kind of regret that changes a person's trajectory. "Instead, you saved 7 men who didn't deserve saving." "Everyone deserves saving," Marlo said. Her voice was hoarse from dehydration and screaming and the breathing tube Vasquez had threatened to intubate her with if she didn't drink more water. "That's the job. That's the whole job." Rothstein nodded slowly. "I'm recommending you for the Silver Star," he said. "Brennan's report makes it clear you were solely responsible for the successful emergency landing. Without your intervention—" "Don't," Marlo interrupted. The morphine was wearing off, and with it her patience for heroic narratives. "Don't make me into something I'm not. I flew a helicopter, that's all. I did the job I was trained to do. If a man had done it, you'd call it Tuesday." The accuracy of the statement hung between them like an accusation. Rothstein had the grace to nod. "You're right, but maybe that's the point. Maybe the story isn't about you being extraordinary. Maybe it's about us finally recognizing ordinary competence when it comes from someone we didn't expect." He left her with that thought, and Marlo turned it over in her mind like a puzzle piece that didn't quite fit the picture she'd been assembling. She'd spent her entire aviation career trying to be invisible, to be so competent that her gender became irrelevant. But competence hadn't made her invisible. It had made her a target. The better she flew, the more men resented her presence, as if her skill was an implicit criticism of their assumptions. And now, having literally fallen from a helicopter and crawled back to save the men who'd wished her gone, she was supposed to accept a medal that would make her visible in a whole new way. The perfect female pilot. The exception that proved the rule. The story men could tell themselves about how they weren't sexist. Look, they'd even given a woman a medal. The morphine haze was fully gone now, leaving her with crystalline clarity and a shoulder that felt like shattered glass. Days passed in the medical ward's strange, timeless rhythm. Marlowe slept and woke and slept again, her body doing the hard work of knitting itself back together. Other patients came and went, men with wounds more visible than hers, trauma written in blood and bandages. They looked at her with curiosity, this female pilot in the recovery ward, her injuries mysterious, her story traveling through camp at the speed of rumor. Some nodded respectfully. Others stared with resentment barely concealed. And a few, the ones who'd been in country long enough to understand how thin the line was between living and dying, looked at her with something approaching reverence. She hated all of it equally. The respect, the resentment, the reverence. She just wanted to fly. But her shoulder had other plans, the joint swollen and angry, the damage extensive enough that Vasquez was already talking about medical evacuation to Japan for proper surgical intervention. On the 5th day, Brennan visited. He looked haggard, older, like the crash had aged him a decade in a week. He carried a folder under his arm, official papers with classified stamps. "They want you to tell the story," he said without preamble. "Public affairs, they think it'll be good for morale. Female pilot saves crew, breaking barriers, all that." Marlowe closed her eyes. "No, I told them you'd say that." He pulled up a chair, sat down heavily. "The thing is, Kine, you don't get to decide. They're going to tell it anyway, with you or without you. And if you don't tell it, they'll tell the version they want. The version that makes everyone comfortable, the girl power story that changes nothing." She opened her eyes, looked at him steadily. "And if I do tell it, Sergeant Davies loses his career and probably goes to prison. Is that what you want?" Brennan's face went carefully neutral. "I want the truth." "The truth," Marlowe said slowly, "is complicated. The truth is that Davies has 2 daughters who need their father, even if their father is a man who did an unforgivable thing. The truth is that you missed a hydraulic leak because you were too proud to listen to me. The truth is that I climbed back onto a falling helicopter not because I'm brave but because I'm stubborn. The truth is that all 7 of us should be dead, and we're not, and sometimes survival is its own complete story." Brennan absorbed this, his jaw working. "You're protecting us," he said finally. "All of us." "Why?" Marlowe thought about her grandfather, about the stories he'd told of crashes and near misses, of pilots who'd made mistakes and lived to fly again because someone had given them grace. "Because," she said, "the military eats its own children fast enough without our help. Because Davies will punish himself better than any court-martial ever could. Because you'll be a better pilot from now on, and that matters more than your humiliation. Because I don't want to be a hero. I want to be a pilot. And heroes are dead ends." He left the folder on her bedside table anyway. Inside, she found the official accident report, the one that would become part of her permanent record. The one that would follow her through every assignment, every promotion board, every moment of her career. It told the sanitized version, mechanical failure, emergency procedures executed flawlessly, exemplary performance under extreme duress. No mention of the push. No mention of the tether. No mention of the moment she'd hung beneath the helicopter, choosing between letting go and pulling herself back toward men who'd wanted her gone. Just the facts, stripped of their emotional truth, rendered into military language that made horror sound like routine. She read it 3 times, searching for lies and finding only omissions. In its own way, the report was a kindness. It let them all move forward without carrying the full weight of what had happened. But kindness, Marlowe had learned, was just another word for complicity. The night before her medical evacuation to Japan, Davies came to see her. He stood at the entrance to the ward for 5 full minutes before working up the courage to approach. When he finally sat down beside her cot, his hands shook. "I wrote you a letter," he said. 23 pages, tried to explain, tried to apologize, tried to make you understand." He pulled out a lighter, flicked it open, and set fire to the pages without showing her a single word. They watched the paper burn together, the flame catching and spreading, turning explanation into ash. "Words don't fix it," he said. "Nothing fixes it, but I need you to know my daughters. I told them about you, not what I did, they can never know that, but I told them about the pilot who saved my life, the best pilot I ever flew with, And Emma, my oldest, she said she wants to fly helicopters now. His voice broke on the last word. Marlowe watched the last of the letter crumble into carbon. Good, she said. The world needs more pilots. Davies wiped his eyes roughly. I don't expect forgiveness. Good, she said again. Because you're not getting it, but you can have something else. You can have the rest of your life to earn it. He stood to leave, then paused. Viper, he said, using her call sign for the first time. Why that name? I never asked. She smiled, small and sad. My grandfather. First time I flew his crop duster, I was 12. Took off too steep, almost stalled it. He grabbed the controls, leveled us out, and said, Marlowe, you fly like a viper, striking fast and aggressive and like you've got something to prove. It stuck. Davies nodded slowly. He'd be proud of you. She turned away before he could see her face. He's dead. He doesn't get to be anything. But that was a lie, and they both knew it. The dead lived in the legacy they left, in the skills they passed down, in the stubbornness of granddaughters who refused to accept that the sky belonged to anyone but themselves. Japan was clean and cold and alien. The military hospital in Yokota felt like a different planet compared to the humid chaos of Vietnam. Marlowe spent 3 weeks in physical therapy, her shoulder worked over by therapists who spoke medical English with Tokyo precision. They were kind but firm, pushing her through pain she'd never imagined, rebuilding the joint one excruciating session at a time. The surgeon, Colonel Nakamura, was blunt. She'd fly again, but never quite the same. The shoulder would always be weak, always be a liability. She'd have to compensate, adjust her technique, accept limitation. For most pilots, it would be career-ending. For Marlowe Kine, it was just another problem to solve. She attacked rehabilitation with the same intensity she'd brought to flight school, logging hours in the gym the way other pilots logged flight time. Her therapists called her obsessive. She called it professional. The difference was semantic. Letters found her in Japan, forwarded from Vietnam through military channels that moved with glacial bureaucracy. Brennan wrote weekly, updates on the squadron, careful avoidance of anything that mattered. Vasquez wrote once, a short note that said simply, "Come back, we need more pilots like you. Hell, we need more people like you." And then, unexpectedly, a letter from Major Rothstein. It was typed, formal, impersonal in its opening. But the last paragraph was handwritten, the penmanship shaky. I have 3 daughters. I never thought about what the military would be like for them. I never had to. That was privilege I didn't recognize. You've made me see things I should have seen decades ago. I'm sorry it took your blood to open my eyes. The Silver Star recommendation was denied, by the way. Command thinks it would be politically charged. They're giving you an air medal with V device instead. Lesser award for greater valor. Welcome to institutional honesty. She didn't cry. Marlowe Kine had learned early that tears were ammunition given freely to people who'd use them against you. But she held the letter for a long time, tracing the handwritten words with her damaged hands, feeling the weight of change measured in grudging military citations. The Air Medal with V device for valor. It was more than most female pilots ever got. It was less than any man would have received for the same actions. It was the exact measure of progress, inches forward while miles remained. She folded the letter carefully, added it to the small collection of papers she kept in her footlocker, and returned to her physical therapy with renewed determination. They could give her whatever medal made them comfortable. She'd keep flying regardless. That was the only victory that mattered, the continued permission to do the thing she loved more than breathing. 3 months after the crash, Marlowe returned to Vietnam. Her shoulder was functional, cleared for flight duty with restrictions. No prolonged operations, no heavy aircraft, no extended combat missions. She was being assigned to training duties where her experience could be better utilized, military speak for sideline but retained for appearances. She arrived at Da Nang on a C-130, her duffel bag light, her expectations lower. The base had changed, or maybe she had. The organized chaos that had once felt overwhelming now seemed almost quaint, manageable, human-scaled. She reported to the flight operations building expecting bureaucratic indifference and found instead a small gathering of pilots, crew chiefs, even some of the men from that night. Brennan stepped forward, face serious. "Captain Kine," he said formally, "welcome back. "We saved something for you." He handed her a flight helmet custom painted, on the side in precise lettering, Viper. And below it something she'd never requested, never expected. 7 small stars, one for each life saved, one for each man who'd learned that survival transcends gender. The helmet was heavy with meaning she didn't want to carry, but Marlowe took it, ran her fingers over the painted stars, and nodded once. "Back to work?" she asked. Brennan smiled. "Back to work." They walked toward the flight line together, and Marlowe felt the familiar pull of helicopters waiting, the turbine whine that was home's true song. Her shoulder ached. Her hand still bore scars from the tether. She'd never fly quite the same way again, never have quite the same confidence in her body's absolute reliability. But she was here. She was flying. And somewhere in Kansas, in the wheat fields where her grandfather had taught her that the sky was a democracy that cared nothing for anything but skill, the wind blew through empty space where a crop duster used to park. She thought about him often now, about his casual mastery, his insistence that fear was just a question waiting for training's answer. She thought about his death sudden, a heart attack at 67, too young and too fast. She thought about the funeral where aviation friends had come from 3 states to tell stories about the pilot who'd flown anything and treated everyone exactly the same. That was the legacy she wanted. Not medals, not recognition, just the memory of competence freely given, equally applied, unmarked by anything but skill. The training missions were tedious but necessary. Marlowe flew with new pilots, teaching them the 1,000 small things that kept helicopters in the sky and people alive. She taught them about hydraulic leaks and emergency tethers and backup plans for backup plans. She taught them that paranoia was just preparedness without PR. She taught them that pride killed more pilots than enemy fire, that the moment you thought you knew everything was the moment the sky would teach you otherwise. And she taught them, without ever saying it directly, that competence had no gender, no race, no qualifier. You were either good enough or you weren't, and everything else was noise manufactured by people afraid that expanding the circle of the capable would somehow diminish their own worth. Some students listened. Some didn't. The ones who didn't usually washed out. The ones who did usually survived. That was the math, pure and brutal and utterly fair. Months became seasons. The war continued its ugly momentum, grinding through lives and helicopters with equal mechanical indifference. Marlowe flew and taught and healed, her shoulder gradually accepting its new limitations, her technique adapting. She learned to use her whole body differently, compensating for lost strength with better positioning, more precise timing, the kind of efficiency that comes only from constraint. In some ways, she flew better now than before. The injury had stripped away any remaining arrogance, any last assumption that skill was enough. Now she flew with humility, with constant awareness, with the understanding that survival was luck and preparation dancing in temporary harmony. Her students noticed. They flew more carefully after training with Viper, more thoughtfully. They checked and rechecked systems. They believed in backup plans. They survived at higher rates than the average. And the difference showed in statistics that couldn't be explained away by coincidence. Word spread through the aviation community in Vietnam and beyond. Female pilot, lost her shoulder saving a crew, still flying, still teaching, still better than most men half her age. The story took on mythical proportions, details added and subtracted through each retelling until Marlowe barely recognized herself in the legend. She'd climbed back onto the helicopter through 40-foot flames, some versions said. She'd flown for an hour on no hydraulics, others claimed. She'd been shot by the crew and survived through pure determination, the wildest rumors insisted. None of it was true, all of it was believed, because people needed heroes and female heroes were rare enough that one